Hey everyone, this is Hunter, and before we get into this week's episode, I want to invite you to Pursuit Night coming up on Friday, October 20th. This fall, in our life together at Fellowship Denver, we've been learning about Jesus' great promise to us that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to him. And that means that when we are obedient to his great commission to go and make disciples, we get to experience his power, his presence, and his authority. And the first way we obey the Great Commission is to just pray for what God has already promised to do. And so we're going to gather over the course of the next year on some select Friday nights in order to pursue God for what he's promised us through prayer and through worship. Now, if you've always experienced group prayer as long-winded and boring, I'm going to be teaching us some new for us habits and practices for praying together. So that's going to be fun to learn. Our worship team is going to be leading us in worship. And so I hope you'll make plans to join us on Friday night, October 20th for our first Pursuit Night. Full details are on our website at fellowshipdenver.org/pursuit. Welcome to the Vision for Life podcast, an ongoing conversation between the pastors of Fellowship Denver and the church at large. Each week we talk about life, faith, the Bible, and what it means to follow Jesus in everyday life. I'm not Autumn. I'm still not Autumn, and I'm still not the host of the Vision for Life podcast. But Autumn was not available today, and we needed to get an episode recorded. So I'm Hunter, one of the pastors of the church, and I'm joined today by my friend and co-laborer, Dave Moreland. Dave, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, not Autumn. It's great to be...
You're not Autumn either.
I'm not Autumn either. Right. But happy to be on the podcast today, though.
Last week, Autumn and I discussed an article by Tim Keller called Lemonade on the Porch: Why and How to Build Porches, the Gospel in a Post-Christian Society. It is an article title with two subtitles. Main title, Lemonade on the Porch. Subtitle number 1, Why and How to Build Porches. Subtitle number 2, The Gospel in a Post-Christian Society. We recorded a conversation about that. This was the last thing Tim Keller wrote before he passed away. Today, you and I are going to talk about a second part of that article, a part 2 of Lemonade on the Porch. And this was published on Gospel in Life by Dr. James Eglinton. And he is essentially filling out the thoughts that Tim Keller had started developing in part 1 of this article series. And he had been processing this and discussing it with Tim Keller as he was dying. And so he's bringing that conversation to the public and putting this on paper for us to discuss.
The essay is really interesting, and it's also, I don't know about you, H, but it was also weird and sad to read it. There's a lot of books that people write that when they die, at some point during the process of writing the book, it's finished by a child or someone or
a
spouse or something. And so it's not totally uncommon to see that in written format, but it was also sad though to see it with Tim Keller's work. But I'm really happy that Eglinton wrote it and was able to capture some of these thoughts that we're going to chat about today.
Yeah, I am glad he wrote it too. And it was a sober reminder that we'll probably all die with work that we're doing that's not finished. And we don't get to choose the time of our death.
That's right. We should all read Leaf by Niggle.
That's a great reminder. God is sovereign, and we'll die with unfinished work. And hopefully we will have done that work well enough and in partnership and community with other people that they can continue that work on. And so in that sense, this is a beautiful article just from that perspective. Why don't we remind folks as we get into this conversation, what do we mean by Lemonade on the Porch? That's the main title. Or what is this porch image that Tim Keller and now James Ecklington are developing?
Well, the big idea is that in a generation sort of before ours, culture provided for the church a kind of porch to church life and church Christian belief. In other words, there's enough shared understanding between people who are Christians and the general culture that people, just by being in the culture, were fairly close to the front door of the church, even if they didn't believe. And Keller is simply making the observation that most people know and have experienced, is that culture no longer provides that porch, which means the church has some work to do, has some construction work. How do we create a front porch, create space that can provide relational, intellectual overlap between non-Christians and Christians that then can make people a little bit closer to that front door?
So in this older culture, not everyone went to church, and not everyone went to church regularly. But if they did attend a church, if you invited them to church and they heard a sermon on sin and forgiveness, for example, they already had some category for sin, and it was a category they had accepted into their worldview. And they would not have been startled to hear the church talking about sin. They would not have said, this is traumatizing, or this is abusive, or this is bad language to talk about sin. They would have generally accepted, like, yeah, sin is a reality, and maybe they would have been convicted that they were more sinful than they had realized. And the church, the preacher in this case, wouldn't have had to do a lot of work to help them even understand what sin was, because the culture they lived in had already done a lot of that preparation work.
And they would also believe that it would be the church's job, that's its job in society, is to tell society what sin is. And so even if they personally didn't want to change their life based on what the church said, they still at the same time said the church ought to function in society in this way because it's better for us to have them doing that.
So a front porch is part of the house. It's attached to the house, but it's more public than the rest of the house. And it's a place between the house and the street. And so people from the street can come onto the porch and talk without having to go all the way inside the house. And if you've ever had a house with a porch, that is kind of how a porch works. It's not that intimidating for someone to stop if they see you sitting on your porch and talk, and maybe even to come up your steps and sit down on the porch with you. It's much more intimate, and it's a much bigger step socially for them to actually come all the way inside your house. And so what Tim Keller was saying with this image of the front porch is, because fewer and fewer people are going to come all the way inside the life of the church, and because for many people, if they do come all the way in, it's going to be stranger than it would have been in an old culture. We need to meet them in a space that is still somehow attached to the church. It's not like a coffee shop. It's still attached to the church, but it is more accessible to them and more neutral in public. And so he's encouraging churches to think about, how do we create these front porch spaces where we can have conversations about our beliefs, about life, in a way that people could start to hear and wrestle with and ask questions about some of the conceptual language of Christianity, and without having to come all the way inside. Like we haven't buried that all the way inside to where they've got to make a huge leap to do that, which that's what you and I've been thinking about together for 20 years.
It's this metaphor is so fascinating because it wasn't a metaphor for us. It was very literal. The very first meetings we had with people interested in, or didn't, we told them it was that the church might be something they should be interested in, like literal meetings on our front porch, inviting people there, hanging out on the front porch, and then feeling the nerves of them coming into the house. Mm-hmm. And than to the basement where there's a Bible study. So the metaphor is really powerful. And I mean, I think the reason why we're talking about this, because it resonates. It's probably more important now to have a front porch, metaphorically and maybe literally, than ever before.
And we've always said in our work together, we want to have at least part of the life of the church that is primarily for people who need a front porch space.
Yep.
They are not the kind of people who are totally comfortable coming all the way inside yet. That could be because they would say, I don't believe in Christianity. It could be because they've had a problem with church or with religion, and they are somewhat interested, but they need a little bit easier, more neutral space to engage. It could be because they have questions they would like to get answered, or they're exploring faith. So we've had many manifestations of that over the years. I can think of you sitting on a stool in a coffee shop and teaching about the original Jesus. And that was a way that we did it in our early days. And part of the reason we did it in a coffee shop is we had no church building.
That's right. And part of the I think appropriate challenge of both of these essays is, especially for us, now that we do have a church building, and there is a kind of settledness that comes with it. There can be a inadvertent complacency to people who would never feel comfortable coming into the church. And we can feel it because every Sunday there seems to be plenty of people in the church for us, but the truth is that there are an increasing number of people who feel less comfortable. So we need to think even harder about creating those porches, and do it in a way where we've thought a lot about what it feels like in the house. Now we need to think, okay, what about the porch?
It's so easy to get happy that our church is growing and there's all kinds of activity on Sundays when we're together, and to lose sight of the fact that the vast majority of our neighbors and our friends are not people that are coming to church. And so how do we kind of create that space for them? That's been one of our burdens as long as we've worked together. And like you said, we have to work hard to keep that edge sharp. I'm hosting a community this fall. Second year I've done this in the fall, called Exploring Faith. And it's a porch community. It actually meets at the church. It meets in the room of the church that is the furthest away from the sanctuary. I think that's like appropriate in some ways. But we meet at the church building, but some of the people who come into this community don't attend regularly, or they attend infrequently, or maybe they have a spouse or a good friend who's an attender, and they're just kind of like, yeah, this is the better space for me. And it is the better space for them. They would not have any connection to our church without the Exploring Faith community. And we talk about their story of their life, and I kind of say, hey, let's assume that God created you. This is your story actually with God. And then we look at a few of the key teachings of Jesus and Passion in the New Testament, which explain the gospel, and we just talk about it in a way that you would talk about it with someone who doesn't believe it all. It's fascinating. And they inevitably find it more interesting and life-giving than they thought they would find it. But I'm just struck every time I leave one of those meetings, I'm just struck by the fact that without this space, these people wouldn't be doing this at all, because they wouldn't just come on Sunday necessarily to hear me preach.
That's right. Well, and I feel like it's touching on the issue in both of these articles, is how there is such a gulf, a widening gulf between secular ways of thinking, non-Christian belief, and gospel thinking, that people who are Christians, who have a heart for people who are exploring faith, they don't even know where the overlap is. And your group is a great example of giving some sort of pathways for that, how you can have those kind of conversations. And the second article is really about, what do you talk about on the porch? What is it that we're trying to accomplish on the porch, and kind of pressing into some of the details, which I really appreciate him doing.
Okay, he has three proposals for how we create porch space and what makes for a good porch. And before we get into those, I just want to draw out one more observation that James Eglinton kind of adds to what Tim Keller has been saying about our culture. And you and I, when we were discussing this before we started recording, we both found this observation to be really fascinating. He says we should think of modern Western culture that we live in not like an unchristian culture that had never heard the gospel before. So we are not like the Greco-Roman world. The gospel first spread throughout the Greco-Roman world, and that was a pre-Christian culture. Literally, they had never heard of anything like Christianity. The closest they might have had was some exposure to Judaism, but their values and their beliefs were really radically different than Christianity. Okay, that's pre-Christian. We live in a society that's sometimes described as post-Christian, meaning after Christendom, but it's different. And it's different in this way. If pre-Christian culture was like Christianity is fresh water and Greco-Roman culture is salt water, and you either have one or the other. Post-Christian culture is brackish water. All of the fresh water of Christian influence for now 2,000 years is still flowing, but as modern culture has become more and more secular, it's become salt water. And we live in a culture where these two kinds of waters mix together. And because of that, modern people tend to have beliefs and values that are kind of like leftover from Christianity, and then they try to combine those with new saltwater beliefs and values that are opposed to Christianity. So they're very conflicted people. I think one example he gives is really helpful. He writes, "The gospel makes a confusing first impression on secular Westerners because some aspects of today's mainstream mentality are the products of Christianity, whereas other closely related strands are based on rejection of Christianity." Then he gives an example. For example, the assumption that sex should be based on consent rather than coercion. That is a product of Christianity.
That's right.
Pre-Christian Greco-Roman culture basically didn't even stigmatize men using their power to dominate and subjugate women to their sexual desires. It just kind of had a notion of the strong dominate the weak. It tended to treat women as purely sexual objects, and men were kind of permitted to live out sexuality in ways they wanted to, in a way that women were very, very vulnerable. As the Christian sex ethic and the gospel took hold in Greco-Roman culture, it changed that radically. We see this on the page of the New Testament. Peter is writing to these converted young Christians, and he's saying, husbands, live with your wives in an understanding way. She is a co-heir with you of the grace of God. I mean, it just the fact that this woman is equal to you was these guys had just learned that. They had just accepted that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And that shaped how people understood and experienced and their expectations of the sexual relationship throughout Western history.
That's right. Okay, so the belief, which is prominent, like the Me Too movement is about this. Sex has to be consensual. We can't use power to, and especially men can't use their power, whether it be physical power or whether it just be positional power, in order to coerce women into sex. Okay, that's a leftover remnant of the Christian worldview. But then he goes on to, but modern Western culture also believes this. It celebrates the use of consent for casual transactional sex. So it says as long as the sex is consensual, any kind of sexual relationship is fine as long as it's consensual. So on the one hand, consensual, that's a vestige of Christianity. but any kind of sexual relationship is fine. That's a rejection of Christianity. And this is just one example of many where the salt water and the fresh water kind of flow together and create these confusing ethics.
Which means that conversations that Christians and disciples of Jesus have with people who are exploring faith, they're going to be riddled with confusion. So on both sides. So you can find yourself resonating with your exploring friend about issues of sexuality in some ways, and then just as easily go into the natural next discussion and be vast worlds apart. And that's just the nature of it.
Yeah. He says, at first introduction, it can be hard for Westerners to tell whether the gospel is good or bad for them or whether they love it or hate it. There's dimensions they're drawn to, and there's dimensions they're like, that's weird and bad. Okay. So if that's the world we live in, and that's the reason why we need to create these front porch spaces, the first way, he says, we create front porch spaces is with hospitality. What's he mean here?
Well, it's a fruit of the gospel. Jesus gave of himself for us so that we can have life with him in God's world. Like, he is the ultimate example of a gracious host. And so because of that, then part of our call to live out the reality of the gospel is to welcome people in. Literally welcome people in to our homes, and not just people who we agree with. There is this expectation. Of course, you can welcome people who are Christians, but also non-Christians and people who you disagree with. You welcome them into your life, into your home, love them, share meals. It is a key marker of Christianity throughout all of church history. And so to practice hospitality, to be hospitable, means welcoming in people who are different than you, who disagree with, and giving them love and welcome in your place.
Now, that's where all of our minds go when we think about hospitality. In this article, James Eglinton is not saying welcome people into your home and have them have meals with them, although I think that's the practical outworking. He is really talking about the posture and the heart posture and the mindset that makes a person hospitable. And he notices that modern secular identities are fragile and competitive. And for this reason, modern secular people struggle with hospitality. Now, I want to translate that a little bit. He's saying we build our sense of self, like who we are, in competition with other people. And so everyone is, even if they're like working in the same field as us, in fact, especially if they're working in the same field as us, they're a competitor for career advancement and achievement, which is they're a direct competitor to me for my sense of identity. He also notices that we often form our sense of who we are in opposition to other people. So they're the bad guys, they're the enemies, and I've really formed my whole reputation and my whole sense of who I am by critiquing those people. If you do that, then it's going to be really hard for you to welcome people into your life who are different. And so you might still have people into your home, you might still have dinner with people, but they're going to be people who you're not competing with, or who you're not trying to, to argue against. So you're going to just make friends with people who are just like you. And Christian hospitality is actually making friends with and welcoming people into your life who are not just like you. So it's not just having your friends over for dinner. It's having people over for dinner who are really different, believe differently than you.
Which means that the true Christian identity and identity formation that's required to do that is really distinct from how that identity formation happens in the broader culture today, right?
Yeah, I thought about what it takes to be confident in who you are and what you believe, and also confident in that you've understood a different perspective and you don't believe it, like you reject it, and yet still to sit down and talk and with someone who holds that perspective. There's just not a lot in modern life that shapes us, informs us to be that kind of person.
No, Tim Keller, he would talk about Christian, not in these articles, but elsewhere. He talks about Christian or gospel polemics. That the heart of a gospel polemic is actually knowing someone else's argument, their worldview, as well as they do, to where they actually feel understood and loved. Like it's a posture of the porch. Oh man, he gets me. He listens. He understands, and then to give the critique within that, but within a relationship of understanding. That's powerful.
When James Eckling talked about how people will tend to construct their identity based on who and what they're against, my mind immediately went to like Christian voices, some of whom I know who have really shaped their public identity as being anti-secular or anti-woke, maybe is the right way, the way they would say it. And I actually agree with so many of their criticisms and their critiques of left-wing secular ideology. I think they're doing good intellectual work in terms of both understanding and critiquing and showing why that's inconsistent with the gospel. And yet when you form your whole sense of this is who I am, usually you actually form it through an online presence. When you form your whole public persona as being anti this, I just think it becomes increasingly hard to actually sit down and talk with those people who would hold those viewpoints, because your whole sense of self has been built on being against them. So part of the work we have to do as Christians is to do appropriate critical analysis of secular thought and yet not build our whole public persona on being anti that. So what I'll do myself, what I coach other young men especially to do, is you actually need to read and understand critiques of secular culture and secular world. I would be really cautious about building a big online presence around that, because I think that will distort your sense of identity in a way that will prevent you from doing hospitality. And I think hospitality is a gospel implication. So, and if you are going to be very online, you need to be really, really judicious about how you're conducting yourself online. And you need to have friends in your life who are going to help you keep an eye on that.
Also knowing too that those online platforms aren't neutral spaces. They're designed to create drama. It's a business. And so providing content for online platforms, what's good for business is more drama. And I mean, everyone now knows this. And how you do that is you create polls, and then the drama and tension between it, and the polls go wider and wider apart. So all that just sort of, I think, should emphasize that point about being cautious about building that online platform on these issues.
Okay, so his first way we build a front porch is through hospitality, which is both a practice of welcoming people, but it's also a posture and a certain kind of presence that you have. A second thing he says we need to do, and this is really the counterbalance to the hospitality, you might say, is what he calls cultural apologetics. Now, this is not apologetics just in the sense of like, well, let me give you some reasons why you should believe in the existence of God. This is cultural apologetics. What does he mean by cultural apologetics?
Well, the big idea is that most sort of secular, like normal people today have a worldview, a belief system that has been mostly unchallenged. They get it in school, they get it at home, they get it sort of in the media. And so their belief system, what the good life is, their understanding of right and wrong, all the things to sort of construct like someone's pathway forward, that whole worldview has never really been challenged in any significant way. And so because of that, there's so much that is assumed, taken for granted, that isn't true. And so cultural apologetics then is this idea of how do you help in a conversation highlight for people and begin to reveal people that maybe some things they've always assumed to be true aren't. Mm-hmm. Maybe they're more the product of how they were raised and the product of their culture than they've really acknowledged. And the porch is a place to have those kinds of conversations. And so it's almost like helping people have conversations with their friends in a way that can lead them to have maybe a bit of a crisis of faith within their progressive secular worldview that they don't even know that they have. That just seems like common sense to them.
I thought of the classic example of a kid who grows up in a Christian environment, in a Christian subculture, a Christian bubble, goes to a Christian school, and perhaps goes off to college at a secular university, and the professor is able to question Christianity in a way they've never heard it questioned before. And suddenly they're having to wrestle with things they've always assumed to be true. And now if we think, many secular people have a similar kind of experience. They grow up in a secular world, in a secular subculture, in a secular bubble, going to secular schools. And when they encounter a thoughtful and intelligent Christian, they might be caused to question their assumed beliefs and their inherited beliefs in a way that is, for the first time in their life, really uncomfortable for them and kind of throws them off balance a little bit. And that's what good cultural apologetics does. It does the same thing that the professor who's trying to deconvert the Christian kid does for secular people.
That's right.
I went to a Christian high school growing up, and I come out of a more secular kind of environment, so I had not grown up in the Christian bubble. But many of the kids I went to high school with had grown up in that whole world. And then when they went to college, they really struggled. And when I went to college, it was just like going back to the world that I had left 3 years ago. and so I went back, and professors would say things that weren't consistent with Christianity. And I would just kind of be like, nah, they just hadn't thought about that. You know? But this work of having to question what you've always assumed to be true, it's part of growing up, and we all have to do that work at some point. Even for kids we raise in our church and who we disciple here in our church, we want them to be able to interact critically with other beliefs, and we don't want them to be shocked when they find intelligent people who don't believe the same thing as they do. And to be an intelligent Christian who can talk about some of these inherited assumptions about the nature of reality with someone in a way that is conversational but also convictional can be really, really confusing to people in a good way.
It can be because, hopefully for like our kids who are growing up in the context of this church, most of them are interacting or having to interact pretty extensively with secular culture. And so their faith is being tested all along the way. Does this actually hold up or not? What's fascinating about these conversations that this article is talking about is that it's actually, it's showing that most people have never had their faith tested in the secular world. It's never actually been tested in any real sense. And these conversations can actually highlight that. And many people, they have had a crisis of faith, but it's sort of manifest more in just disillusionment and cynicism, and I just don't think about those things anymore, and just kind of filling their mind and their life up with various entertainments and distractions. But really, it's a crisis of faith.
I want to put a plug in here for my favorite Tim Keller book, which is Making Sense of God. And in this book, he actually shows you some of the baseline assumptions that many modern secular people have about reality. And he does the work of analyzing them and questioning them from inside a Christian worldview. So if you want to be conversant in these, I think this book is a great place to start. It's one of his, or he said this was one of his least best-selling books. and so I think it's not highly read, but it would be great for our listeners to engage with. For example, he talks about things like suffering and satisfaction, or the good life. He talks about a sense of identity and building a self. He talks about what do we hope for in the future. These are the kinds of things that everyone has inherited beliefs about, and they probably never examined them.
That's right. So if you've ever read The Reason for God, that this book, Making Sense of God, is sort of a prequel. If the distance is too far, read Making Sense of God and then A Reason for God.
The Reason for God is what you would call classical apologetics, and Making Sense of God is what he's now calling cultural apologetics. Okay, the last practice he encourages us to have in order to create these front porch spaces is forgiveness.
Wow. Now, he brings this up, I think, because most people in majority culture don't have a category for it. Or they don't, it seems as if they don't have a meaningful way intellectually to make forgiveness work within their inherited intellectual philosophical systems.
And many people in the church don't either, because we've been converted by the culture.
That's right.
In this, all you have to do is have one Christian person inside the church wrong you, or have a conflict with them, and people suddenly find it really hard to forgive them. and even if they've been listening to the gospel and hearing the gospel, and this tells me that forgiveness is a place where God often uses the need to forgive someone in order to help the gospel get down into our souls in a way that it just hadn't gotten down there yet. And if you think about the nature of the gospel is the only person who is perfectly righteous and could legitimately and righteously and justifiably hold his enemies accountable, not only forgives them, but actually does the work of reconciling them to himself, and then pours an abundance of grace and mercy back into their lives in order to do good to them. That is the gospel. God atones for our sin. God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit have agreed together to do the work of absorbing our sin. And so the Father sends the Son, and the Son suffers in our place, and the Spirit sustains him through that. And somehow in God's divine economy that satisfies the demands of justice, Paul says this in Romans chapter 3, verse 21, God is both just, he's still just, even though he forgives, and he is the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus. And we can even see that true experientially, like people who receive the free grace of God and it gets down in their hearts, they don't become unjust people who then inflict more injustice back into the world. They become agents of reconciliation and healing themselves. And it's just amazing that God in his wisdom has done that. And what forgiveness says is, because God's done that for you, when you bear within yourself the cost of what someone has done, and when you turn back grace toward them, that doesn't destroy you. And people, we just think, we emotionally, but we also intellectually think, if I forgive someone, it's just going to allow injustice to continue. I mean, how many people rationalize their anger by saying, well, if I wasn't so angry, then there would be no way to stop injustice. And the scandal of the gospel is like, actually, your anger is not going to accomplish justice. And if you forgive someone and pour grace back into their lives, that's actually the way that stops injustice.
You can hear the frustration in Peter's lips when he says to Jesus, how many times do I forgive my brother?
7 times?
Up to 7 times.
7 times?
And then Jesus says, 70 times 7. In other words, like, bro, you're not even thinking about this the right way.
Yeah, it's like not twice as many times, but you're thinking about 7 times. Let me just give you an equation that goes to 490. Like you're probably going to lose track somewhere before you get to 490. Right. So it's just really infinite number of times.
It's a totally different way of thinking that I think, which is why bringing it up in the porch is so fascinating, because it's just as compelling and powerful and needed and hard to wrap your mind around today as it was for Peter when Jesus first introduced this idea to him. And we can't look at the shape of the New Testament in the early church without seeing that this is a key way they were different. When you are reviled, you do not revile in return. When you're persecuted, you love those who persecute. Like, this is practically how we're different. And why not highlight this difference on the porch?
Well, there it is. We create these porches by being people who are committed to hospitality, not just in the come over to my house sense, but that's a good place to start, but also in the posture we have toward people who we legitimately disagree with and have substantial differences and who we know and think are wrong about a number of things. And we create porches by being able to do cultural apologetics, which is we understand some of the assumptions that most people in our culture have, and we're able to talk about those assumptions in a way that invites them to question it for the first time. And we also do it by being people who just have a whole lifestyle of forgiveness. So we're not angsty and angry and punitive toward people who we have substantial disagreements with.
You have that posture, those conversations on the porch. There's no other porches more compelling than that right now.
Yeah.
That porch will get pretty crowded. People might even want to go inside the front door.
I think that's a good place to end our conversation. It's been really fun to wrestle through this last legacy of Tim Keller. Dave, we had a conversation a couple weeks ago on Tim Keller's life and legacy, and it's been great to wrestle with the final things he was thinking about before he passed away. And our hope is that this is our church. And toward that end, we pray that folks will pick up this article and will read it and process it and be talking with others about how we can be porch people.
Amazing.
Well, Dave, thanks for joining me, and thanks to everyone for listening today and engaging this conversation. And we love hearing from our listeners. We like hearing ideas they have for future topics. We like receiving articles and things they've been reading or their questions that they would like to hear us discuss. So if you have any of that, send it to us at podcast@fellowshipdenver.org, and we will get Autumn to check that email and construct wonderful future episodes.
Thanks for joining us on the Vision for Life podcast. Special thanks to Adam England for our theme music, to Jesse Cowan, our producer, and to Judd Connell, who provides transcription for these episodes.